Commander Velnox of the 3rd Korthak hunting fleet had seen many things that defied logic in his 2 centuries of military service. But watching 3 of his finest alpha cubs, bred from the most ferocious bloodlines in the Empire, cowering behind a supply crate like frightened hatchlings, that was a new low, even for what the humans called a really bad day. "Explain to me again," Velnox growled, his razor-sharp teeth clicking with barely contained frustration, "how 3 cubs trained from birth to rip apart enemy battlecruisers are currently hiding from a single human female who weighs approximately 1/8 of their combined mass." Sub-Commander Threshka, a scarred veteran whose left mandible bore the marks of countless battles, shifted uncomfortably in his ceremonial armor. "Sir, the cubs encountered the human during our supply run on Station Gamma 7. Initial contact protocols suggested standard intimidation tactics would be sufficient to establish dominance. However, Velnox's voice dropped to the dangerous octave that made junior officers reconsider their career choices. The human began making strange sounds at them, high-pitched vocalizations that our linguistic experts cannot classify. The cubs, sir, they began to vibrate. If Velnox had possessed eyebrows, they would have achieved orbital velocity. Vibrate? You mean the war purr of impending violence? No, sir, the contentment vibration. The one cubs typically reserve for their birth mothers. The silence that followed could have been weaponized and sold to the Galactic Arms Council as a crowd control device. Velnox studied his 3 cubs, Razor-Fang, Bloodclaw, and Deathstrike, who were indeed producing the soft, rhythmic rumbling that indicated complete relaxation and happiness. Razor-Fang, the largest of the 3 at nearly 4 meters of pure predatory muscle, was currently making what could only be described as tiny squeaking noises while staring at the human female through the gaps in the supply crates. Bloodclaw and Deathstrike flanked their pack leader, equally transfixed by whatever sorcery the small bipedal creature was employing. "And what?" Velnox asked with the patience of someone who had recently discovered that the universe possessed a sense of humor, and it was decidedly twisted. "Is the human doing now?" Sub-Commander Threshka consulted his tactical display with the expression of someone reading his own death warrant. "She appears to be knitting, sir." "Knitting?" The word emerged from Velnox's throat like a curse in 17 different languages. "Creating textiles from fibrous materials using primitive implements. Our cultural database indicates it's a human recreational activity often associated with relaxation and affection." The human in question, who had been completely unaware that she was the center of an interspecies crisis, looked up from her yarn work and noticed the 3 massive predators watching her from behind their inadequate hiding spot. Instead of screaming, running, or activating the emergency beacon that any rational being would have used when confronted by creatures capable of reducing battle armor to decorative confetti, she smiled. The cub's contentment vibrations increased to a frequency that was starting to rattle the supply crates. "She's looking at them," Threshka reported unnecessarily. "I have functioning optical sensors, Sub-Commander." "Sir, she's approaching them." Dr. Eve Calloway had been having what could charitably be called a frustrating week. Her research on cross-species behavioral adaptation had hit every bureaucratic roadblock the Galactic Academic Council could devise. Her funding had been cut by entities who apparently believed that understanding alien psychology was less important than developing new ways to blow things up. And her coffee maker had achieved sentience just long enough to declare independence before exploding in her quarters. Finding 3 enormous alien predators hiding behind supply crates like overgrown children was, frankly, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in months. "Hello there," she said in the gentle tone she typically reserved for nervous animals and grant committee members. "What are you 3 doing back there?" Razor-Fang, Bloodclaw, and Deathstrike exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both terror and fascination. In the Korthak cultural lexicon, there were exactly 47 appropriate responses to being addressed by a potential enemy. Squeaking like a distressed mechanical component was not among them. Yet that's precisely what Razor-Fang did. "You're beautiful, aren't you?" Eve continued, apparently unbothered by the fact that she was complimenting beings who could have used her spine as a toothpick. "Look at those markings, and those eyes. You must be apex predators, but you're curious about everything, aren't you? The cub's vibrations had reached frequencies that were causing sympathetic resonance in the station's support structures. Several deck plates were beginning to hum in harmony. Back in the command post, Velnox was experiencing what human psychologists might have classified as an existential crisis. Sub-Commander, remind me exactly what the Elders warned us about humans. Threshka accessed his cultural files with the enthusiasm of someone performing dental surgery on himself. The warnings specify that humans are master manipulators capable of corrupting the battle spirit of even the most disciplined warriors. They supposedly possess psychological weapons that can turn our greatest strengths into weaknesses, reducing proud Korthak fighters to... He paused, checking the translation matrix. The exact phrase appears to be snuggle-seeking larvae. Snuggle-seeking larvae? Velnox repeated the words as if they were in a language designed by sadistic linguists with too much time and too little supervision. It's a human term, sir. The cultural database suggests it refers to juvenile creatures who seek physical comfort and affection from parental figures. They both turned to observe the cubs, who had now emerged completely from their hiding spot and were arranging themselves in a semicircle around the human female. Eve had set aside her knitting and was speaking to them in the kind of soft, encouraging tones that typically preceded either diplomatic breakthroughs or complete psychological breakdowns. "And you," she was saying to Deathstrike, who was currently positioned flat on his belly with his massive head tilted at an angle that maximized his ability to gaze adoringly at her. "You're the thoughtful one, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes. You think before you act. That's wisdom." Deathstrike, who had earned his name by calculating the optimal trajectory for launching enemies into stellar bodies, made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a sigh of contentment. "Sir," Threshka said carefully, "the cubs appear to be exhibiting behavioral patterns consistent with attachment formation." "Attachment formation," Velnox repeated with the tone of someone who had just discovered that his entire worldview was constructed from materials roughly equivalent to wet tissue paper. "They're bonding. With a human." "Yes, sir." "And, sir? According to our behavioral specialists, once a Korthak forms an attachment bond, it becomes permanent." The implications hit Velnox like a meteorite strike to the cognitive centers. 3 of the Empire's most promising young warriors, bred and trained to be the next generation of fleet commanders, were in the process of adopting a human female as their pack mother. The Elders were going to have opinions about this. Strong ones. The kind that typically involved formal executions and posthumous disgrace. Eve had moved closer to the cubs, apparently unconcerned by the fact that their claws could have shredded her into constituent atoms with minimal effort. Instead, she was examining Razor-Fang's left forepaw with the focused attention of a professional. "You've got a small cut here," she murmured, producing a small medical kit from her research bag. "Just a little scratch, but we should clean it up." "May I?" Razor-Fang, who had been trained to ignore injuries that would have hospitalized lesser beings, extended his paw with the trust of a creature who had found something precious and was terrified of losing it. "There we go," Eve said as she cleaned and dressed the minor wound with gentle efficiency. "All better." The 3 cubs exchanged another of those meaningful looks that seemed to involve complex emotional negotiations conducted entirely through eye contact. Then, in a movement so coordinated it appeared choreographed, they all moved closer to the human. "Oh my," Eve said with obvious delight as she found herself surrounded by 3 creatures whose combined weight exceeded that of most atmospheric shuttles. "You really are affectionate, aren't you?" Razor-Fang, demonstrating a delicacy that would have amazed his combat instructors, gently nuzzled Eve's shoulder. Bloodclaw positioned himself on her other side, while Deathstrike completed the protective circle by settling behind her. From their command post, Velnox and Threshka watched in horrified fascination, as 3 of the Empire's finest warriors transformed into what could only be described as oversized therapy animals. "Sub-Commander," Velnox said with the tone of someone who had achieved a state of calm through the simple expedient of accepting that reality was no longer operating according to recognizable principles, How long until the elders expect our report on the cubs' training progress? Approximately 6 standard hours, sir. And how exactly do you propose we explain that our apex predator cubs have been domesticated by a human female wielding yarn and kindness? Before Threshka could formulate a response that wouldn't result in immediate court-martial proceedings, their tactical display erupted with proximity alerts. 3 more Korthak vessels had just dropped out of hyperspace, their energy signatures identifying them as Elder Command ships. "Sir," Threshka said with the voice of someone watching his pension evaporate in real time, "the elders have arrived early." Velnox observed his cubs, who were now creating a harmony of contentment sounds, while their newly adopted human mother continued to knit what appeared to be a scarf in colors that complemented their natural markings. "Outstanding," he said, with the kind of bitter sarcasm that could have powered a small fusion reactor. "This should be educational." The communication system crackled to life with the imperious tones of Elder War Master Sek Thul, whose voice carried the authority of someone who had personally invented several particularly effective forms of military discipline. "Commander Velnox, prepare for immediate inspection. We trust your cubs have maintained the traditional standards of Korthak warrior development, and have shown proper resistance to human psychological manipulation." Velnox looked at his cubs, who were currently competing for the privilege of resting their massive heads in Eve's lap while she hummed softly and continued her knitting. "About that," he said into the communicator, "there may have been some unexpected developments." The silence that followed was the kind that typically preceded either enlightenment or apocalypse. In Velnox's experience, the universe had a distinct preference for the latter. "Define unexpected, Commander." Elder War Master Sek Thul's voice carried the temperature of deep space, and twice the hospitality. Velnox glanced at his cubs, who had now arranged themselves in what military tacticians might recognize as a defensive formation, if those same tacticians had been subjected to severe head trauma, and possibly recreational psychotropic substances. The cubs were protecting their human, yes, but they were doing it while making sounds that suggested they were auditioning for positions in an interstellar lullaby choir. "Well, sir, the cubs have demonstrated remarkable adaptation to human contact." "Adaptation?" The elder's voice climbed to frequencies that made several junior officers wince and check their audio equipment for malfunctions. "They've learned to coexist with human behavioral patterns." Through the tactical display, Velnox could see the Elder Command ships adjusting their approach vectors. 3 massive vessels, each one capable of reducing this entire station to its component molecules, were now bearing down on them with what appeared to be righteous indignation as their primary guidance system. Eve, blissfully unaware that she was about to become the center of an interstellar diplomatic incident, had finished her scarf and was now attempting to drape it around Razor-Fang's enormous neck. "There we go," she murmured as she adjusted the colorful fabric. "Now you look absolutely dashing. Very distinguished." Razor-Fang preened with the kind of obvious pleasure typically reserved for warriors who had just conquered their 3rd star system before breakfast. His pack brothers watched with what could only be described as envy as their leader modeled his new accessory. "Oh, don't worry," Eve said, apparently recognizing their expressions with the same ease she might read a particularly simple children's book. "I have yarn for all of you. We'll get you properly outfitted." Bloodclaw and Deathstrike practically vibrated with anticipation, their contentment frequencies now reaching levels that were causing crystalline structures throughout the station to sing in sympathetic resonance. "Commander Velnox," Subcommander Threshka said with the tone of someone who had just realized he was standing in the path of an oncoming avalanche, "the elder ships are requesting immediate docking clearance. They want to conduct the inspection personally." "Of course they do," Velnox muttered, watching as Eve began measuring Deathstrike's neck with what appeared to be a piece of string, because allowing them to observe this catastrophe from a safe distance would be far too reasonable. The cubs had begun making those harmonious vocalizations again, their voices blending together in patterns that spoke of deep contentment and emotional security. It was the kind of sound that typically indicated successful pack bonding, the formation of family units, and the complete abandonment of everything their military training had attempted to instill in them. "Sir," Threshka ventured carefully, What are we going to tell the elders? Velnox considered his options, which ranged from catastrophically inadequate to hilariously suicidal. The truth would result in immediate execution for failure to maintain proper warrior discipline. Lies would result in eventual execution when the truth inevitably emerged. Creative interpretations of reality would result in execution preceded by extensive and imaginative torture. We're going to tell them exactly what happened, he decided with the grim resignation of someone who had reached the acceptance stage of his own professional demise. And then we're going to hope that the Cubs' new attachment behaviors extend to protecting their commanding officers. The station's docking bay alerts chimed with the arrival of the first Elder Command vessel. Through the tactical display, Velnox could see figures disembarking, imposing Korthak elders, whose very presence seemed to darken the surrounding atmosphere with the weight of ancient authority and extremely limited patience. Elder Warmaster Sek Thul strode through the station corridors with the kind of purposeful menace typically reserved for natural disasters and tax auditors. Behind him, Elders Krakvos and Thexmore flanked his advance like mobile monuments to military disapproval. Their ceremonial armor clanked with each step, creating a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a funeral march. "Where are these supposedly compromised cubs?" Sek Thul demanded, his voice carrying enough authority to make the station's artificial gravity consider filing for early retirement. Velnox gestured toward the supply bay with the enthusiasm of someone directing visitors to their own execution chamber. "Just through those doors, Elder Warmaster. I should mention that the human is still present and the cubs appear to have formed." Silence. Sek Thul's tone could have flash-frozen stellar plasma. "We shall evaluate this contamination ourselves." The doors hissed open to reveal a scene that violated approximately 3 centuries of Korthak military doctrine. Eve sat cross-legged on the floor, now wearing what appeared to be a matching scarf to Razor-Fang's, while carefully braiding some kind of decorative rope from multicolored yarn. Bloodclaw was sprawled on his side, allowing her to use his massive flank as a backrest, while Deathstrike had positioned his head in her lap for what could only be described as premium petting access. The elders froze in collective horror. "By the 7 war moons of our ancestors," Elder Krakvos whispered, his battle-scarred mandibles clicking in rapid succession. "What have they done to our warriors?" Eve looked up from her crafting project and smiled at the newcomers with the same gentle warmth she'd shown the cubs. "Oh, hello there. Are you friends of these wonderful boys? They're absolutely delightful." Razor-Fang raised his head and made a soft chirping sound, the kind typically used by Korthak cubs to greet beloved family members. His scarf, which featured an intricate pattern of blues and golds that somehow complemented his natural coloring, caught the light as he moved. Elder Thexmore's optical sensors dilated with shock. That apex predator just made greeting sounds. At strangers, without establishing dominance protocols. "Worse," Sek Thul said with the tone of someone watching his entire worldview spontaneously combust. "He's wearing decorative textiles, willingly." Eve had noticed the new arrival's obvious distress and immediately shifted into what she called her diplomatic academic mode. She gently moved Deathstrike's head from her lap and stood up, brushing yarn fibers from her clothing. "You must be their instructors," she said warmly. "I hope you don't mind that I've been spending time with them. They seemed lonely, and I thought some companionship might help." The 3 cubs immediately repositioned themselves around Eve in what their military training had taught them was a protective formation. However, instead of bristling with aggressive readiness, they were making those harmonious humming sounds that indicated supreme contentment. "Companionship?" Elder Sek Thul repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept that had been poorly translated by malfunctioning equipment. "Oh yes," Eve continued, completely oblivious to the existential crisis she was causing. "Social creatures need emotional support and affection to develop properly. These 3 are clearly highly intelligent and emotionally sophisticated. They've just been missing the nurturing component of their psychological development." She reached up to scratch behind Razor-Fang's auditory sensors, and the massive predator actually leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "Nurturing," Elder Krakvos repeated faintly. "Emotional support," added Elder Thexmore, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone discovering that everything he'd believed about reality was fundamentally incorrect. "Of course," Eve said, as if she were explaining basic atmospheric composition to elementary students. "Apex predators and social species require strong emotional bonds to function optimally. Without proper attachment relationships, they become anxious, aggressive, and ultimately self-destructive." Bloodclaw had moved closer during this exchange and was now gently nuzzling Eve's free hand. She absently began stroking his massive head while continuing her impromptu lecture. "Look at their stress indicators," she pointed out. "Relaxed musculature, steady breathing patterns, optimal hormone balance reflected in their vocalizations and scent markers. These three are healthier and happier than they've probably been since they were separated from their birth packs." The elders exchanged glances that could have powered a small fusion reactor with their sheer intensity of horrified realization. "Commander Velnox," Sekthul said slowly, "how long has this therapeutic intervention been occurring?" "Approximately 4 standard hours, Elder War Master." 4 hours, Thexmore said with the wonder of someone contemplating the heat death of the universe, "and they've been completely transformed from warriors into healthy, well-adjusted young adults with proper emotional regulation," Eve finished, helpfully. "The capacity was always there. They just needed someone to show them that vulnerability and affection weren't weaknesses to be eliminated, but strengths to be cultivated." Deathstrike had now joined his pack brothers in the surround the human with protective affection formation. All three cubs were creating a symphony of contentment that was making the station's hull resonate like a massive musical instrument. "This is impossible," Elder Krakvos declared with the conviction of someone whose fundamental understanding of genetics had just been challenged by knitting needles and yarn. "Korthak warriors are bred for aggression, dominance, and territorial expansion. Emotional attachment is trained out of them from hatching to prevent exactly this kind of compromise." Eve's expression shifted to something that might have concerned the elders if they'd been better at reading human facial expressions. There was a hardness in her eyes that suggested they'd just stumbled into territory where her professional expertise and personal convictions intersected in potentially explosive ways. "You train emotional attachment out of them?" she asked with deceptive calm. "Naturally," Sekthul replied, apparently missing the warning signs. "Emotional bonds create weakness, dependency, and strategic vulnerabilities. A proper warrior maintains only loyalty to the Empire and dedication to victory." The cubs had sensed the change in Eve's emotional state and had shifted their positioning slightly. They were still protective, but now there was an edge to their stance that suggested they were prepared to defend their human mother from threats both physical and psychological. "Let me understand this correctly," Eve said, her voice carrying the kind of professional precision that made academic colleagues check their research twice and funding committees reconsider their life choices. "You deliberately damage the psychological development of highly intelligent, emotionally complex creatures in order to make them more effective at violence." "We create perfect warriors," Elder Thexmore said, with pride that was about to become spectacularly misplaced. "You create traumatized children with weapons training," Eve corrected. And suddenly her gentle demeanor had been replaced by something that made the cub's protective formation tighten around her. "No wonder your military forces suffer from such high rates of operational dysfunction, interpersonal conflict, and strategic failures." The silence that followed could have been marketed as a sound-dampening material for spacecraft hulls. "Strategic failures?" Sekthul's voice climbed to frequencies typically reserved for emergency communications. "Your approach to warrior development violates every principle of optimal performance psychology," Eve continued with the ruthless efficiency of someone presenting research findings to a hostile peer review committee. "Emotional stability, strong social bonds, and secure attachment relationships are prerequisites for effective decision-making under stress, creative problem-solving, and unit cohesion." She gestured to the cubs, who were now watching the elders with expressions that somehow managed to combine protective alertness with profound disappointment. "These three have shown more tactical innovation, collaborative behavior, and adaptive thinking in 4 hours of proper emotional support than your traditional methods probably produce in years of training. And you want to know why?" The elders appeared to be experiencing what human psychologists might classify as cognitive dissonance, severe enough to require professional intervention. Because, Eve continued, warming to her subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that her life's work was more relevant than she'd ever imagined. Creatures who feel safe and loved are willing to take intelligent risks, trust their teammates, and think beyond immediate survival responses. Your current training methods produce anxiety-driven reactive behavior patterns that masquerade as strength, but actually represent profound strategic limitations. Razor-Fang made a soft vocalization that sounded suspiciously like agreement, and his pack brothers responded with harmonized sounds that indicated concurrence with their human mother's assessment. The cubs agree with me, Eve noted with satisfaction. They understand what you've been doing to them, and they understand that there's a better way. Elder War Master Sekthul looked at his supposedly perfect warrior cubs, who were currently using their apex predator status to form a protective barrier around a human female who had just systematically dismantled 3 centuries of military doctrine using psychology textbooks and knitting supplies. What? He asked with the tone of someone whose entire career had just been reevaluated by forces beyond his control. Are you suggesting? Eve smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded everyone present why humans had earned their reputation as a species capable of reshaping the galaxy, according to their own peculiar vision of how things ought to work. I'm suggesting that you let me redesign your entire approach to warrior development. These cubs are going to become the finest military leaders your empire has ever produced, but they're going to do it while maintaining their capacity for love, trust, and emotional connection. She looked at each of the elders in turn, and somehow a human female who barely reached their shoulder height managed to project the kind of authority typically reserved for beings who commanded star fleets. The choice is yours, she said. You can continue producing damaged soldiers who fight because they don't know how to do anything else, or you can start creating balanced warriors who fight because they have something worth protecting. The cubs arranged themselves more tightly around Eve and began that harmonious humming again. But now there was something different in the sound. It wasn't just contentment anymore. It was unity, purpose, and the kind of determination that could reshape empires. Elder War Master Sekthul looked at the human who had revolutionized 3 centuries of military tradition with yarn and kindness, then at the cubs who had found something in her arms that they'd been missing their entire lives. Doctor, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to encompass the future of his entire civilization. When do we begin? Eve's smile transformed from professional satisfaction to something warmer, more genuine. We begin with understanding what you've already got right here. She turned to the 3 cubs, who had been following the conversation with the kind of focused attention typically reserved for tactical briefings and feeding schedules. Razor-Fang, Bloodclaw, Deathstrike, she said, addressing each of them directly. You've been trained to be warriors, yes? To protect your people and fight for your empire? The cubs' harmonized response was immediate and enthusiastic, a complex vocalization that somehow managed to convey both affirmation and excitement about the prospect of being asked their opinion on something important. But you also understand now that being strong doesn't mean being alone, doesn't it? Another round of those musical sounds, this time with undertones that suggested they were sharing concepts with each other as much as communicating with Eve. Remarkable, Elder Krakvos murmured, his earlier horror shifting into something approaching wonder. They're actually discussing tactical philosophy, as a unit. Of course they are, Eve said, as if collaborative strategic thinking were the most natural thing in the world. They're not just individual warriors anymore. They're a bonded pack with complementary strengths and shared objectives. Watch this. She looked at Razor-Fang and made a soft clicking sound. Not Korthak language, but something she'd apparently improvised during their time together. The large cub immediately moved to her left side and assumed what was clearly a protective stance, but one that left his flanks open for support. Another sound, and Bloodclaw flowed into position on her right, his posture mirroring his pack brothers while maintaining tactical awareness of different approach vectors. A third sound brought Deathstrike to her back, completing a formation that would have impressed military instructors if they could have gotten past the fact that it was being coordinated through knitting-based communication techniques. Perfect tactical positioning achieved through trust-based coordination, rather than fear-based compliance, Eve announced with the pride of someone whose research had just jumped from theoretical to revolutionary. Response time? 3.7 seconds, Commander Velnox reported automatically, then caught himself. Sir, that's faster than our best. Drill teams achieve with standard command protocols. Elder Thex Moore was studying the formation with the expression of someone watching his fundamental assumptions about military science reorganize themselves in real time. The coordination is flawless. No hierarchy conflicts, no positional competition, no resource guarding behaviors. Because they trust each other and they trust me, Eve explained. When you know your packmates will cover your vulnerabilities, you can focus entirely on your own tactical responsibilities instead of constantly monitoring for betrayal or abandonment. She made another sound, longer, more complex, and the cubs shifted into a different formation entirely. This one was clearly designed for mobile advance under hostile conditions, with each member covering specific zones while maintaining visual contact with their teammates. How many formations can they execute? Elder Sekthul asked, his voice carrying the kind of professional interest that suggested his earlier horror was rapidly transforming into strategic excitement. As many as we can develop together, Eve replied. The limit isn't their intelligence or their physical capabilities. It's their trust in the system and their understanding of the mission parameters. Traditional military training caps both of those by treating loyalty as something that has to be enforced rather than earned. Razor-Fang made a soft questioning sound, and Eve immediately relaxed her posture. The formation dissolved as the cubs returned to their protective but casual arrangement around her. Good boys, she murmured, scratching behind each of their auditory sensors in turn. You did perfectly. The contentment vibrations resumed, but now they were overlaid with something new, a sense of accomplishment and purpose that hadn't been there before. They're proud, Commander Velnox observed with obvious amazement. Not just satisfied, but genuinely proud of their performance. Pride in achievement rather than fear of punishment as a motivational framework, Eve nodded. It's sustainable, self-reinforcing, and scales up to larger unit operations without creating internal competition that undermines unit cohesion. She looked at the three elders, who were now studying the cubs with expressions that suggested intensive mental recalculation of everything they thought they knew about military training. The question now is whether you're ready to revolutionize not just how you train warriors, but what you understand warriors to be, she continued. These three aren't just going to be better fighters. They're going to be better leaders, better strategists, and better representatives of whatever values your empire actually wants to project into the galaxy. Elder War Master Sekthul approached the cubs slowly, his massive frame somehow managing to project curiosity rather than threat. When he was close enough to clearly see their faces, he made a traditional Korthak greeting vocalization. All three cubs responded immediately, but their greeting sounds included harmonies and complexity levels that made the traditional response seem almost primitive by comparison. They've enhanced the cultural protocols, he said with wonder. Taken our basic communication framework and added collaborative elements that increase information density and emotional content. They've grown, Eve said simply. Emotionally, intellectually, and socially. And this is just the beginning. The cubs seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Without any prompting from Eve, they moved into a new formation, one she hadn't taught them. Razor-Fang positioned himself facing the elders, while his pack brothers flanked him in a display that managed to be both respectful and confident. Then, in perfect synchronization, all three cubs made a vocalization that was clearly directed at their military superiors. What are they saying? Eve asked, fascinated by this spontaneous communication. Elder Sekthul listened carefully, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that might have been hope mixed with profound respect. They're offering themselves as willing participants in whatever changes we implement, he translated. But more than that, they're volunteering to help train the next generation of cubs using these new methods. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Not only had the cubs embraced Eve's approach, they wanted to become teachers themselves, spreading emotional intelligence and trust-based cooperation throughout their entire military culture. They understand that they're not just students anymore, Eve realized, her voice filled with maternal pride. They're pioneers, The first generation of Korthak warriors who will choose love as their strength, rather than have it forced out of them. Bloodclaw approached Elder Thexmore and made a gentle, questioning sound. When the elder nodded uncertainly, the massive cub carefully nuzzled the ancient warrior's armored shoulder, a gesture of affection and acceptance that transcended every military protocol in their shared history. "The revolution begins now," Sekthul declared, watching his centuries of rigid doctrine crumble and reform into something infinitely more powerful. "And it begins with trust."